Where were you born and raised?
Forestville, Maryland. Which is Southern Maryland around DC, and I lived there. So went to college at 18, and I went to Rhode Island for college.
Oh, so you've always been out that way.
Yeah, except for I went to Johnson and Wales, went to school to be a chef, um, and then in 2004 I moved to Chicago for 14 years.
What were you doing in Chicago?
Food importation for most of it, and then I did cook for 3.5 years, 4 years.
What about fishing? Where did that enter the mix?
Oh, I started fishing very young when I was roughly six-ish with my dad. You know, red wigglers and worms under a bobber, minnows, whatever. The way I got into fly fishing was really it was a TV show of fly fishing the world with John Barrett. Imagine, it's 1990 or whatever, Saturday mornings on ESPN. We had just gotten cable finally, and they had fishing shows every Saturday morning. And this guy would have these no-name stars like Kevin Costner and Michael Keaton, who was Batman at the time, right?
No
Um,
name stars. Okay, so the big time
yeah,
guys. Yeah.
yeah. Oh, he had Liam Neeson right after Schindler's List. The Fonz was on there, Henry Winkler. Like he had huge stars. Chrissy Everett went on there. This is when she was, winning Wimbledon and the US Open and stuff. And on top of it, like he didn't just go to, oh, we're going to go to the Catskills. No, no, he went to he went to Chile. He went to New Zealand and flew in helicopters. Like he went to the world-class destinations, spared no expense with these stars. And some of them are, Liam Neeson was already a fly angler, but Michael Keaton, still a fly fisherman to this day.
Wait,
Huey
is that
Lewis in the
how he
news,
got into it? Is that how Michael Keaton got into fly fishing?
I believe so. I believe I remember him saying that he had never done it before on the show. So
Cool.
I don't know him, but yeah. Huey Lewis, same thing. I don't know if Chrissy at that point was with Andy or not. So I don't know where she got first, introduced. Um, but yeah, like all these people. The Fonz, I don't know if he had done it before, but I know he's a huge angler. I have his book. Like his book is quite funny. So yeah, that's what got me wanting to fly fish because it just looked pretty. And it was always a story about it wasn't the fish. It was this beautiful destination. It was this wonderful town folk that they met in this place or whatever it is. And it was just it pulled at me. So
Got it. What about fly
yeah.
tying? Because obviously this is going to be a big part of our discussion today is your experience behind the vise. And there's lots to talk about, but let's start with how it all started for you.
I was at the local pizza joint and we came out and there was a little county fair or city fair thing, whatever, and there was a guy there tying deer hair flies. I remember that he gave me a green and yellow bass popper. At the time, I couldn't throw it, I couldn't catch anything on it, but it intrigued me. Um, so I wanted to try to tie my own flies. My parents got me a Cabela's starter kit. I had a Thompson double A in it or a Thompson model A, I mean, for whatever it was, $39 from Cabela's. And a year later, I was still trying to tie flies. I was awful, right?
Were you in high school? How old
Um,
were you approximately?
12 or 13.
Okay.
So right before high school, I got it, I think, either my seventh or eighth grade year, the kit for Christmas. I
That's
remember that.
early. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was, completely self-taught. That they bought me a book. In fact, as you know, I'm moving. So I just packed that book. Like it's one of the few books I don't want to get rid of, even though it's an awful book.
What
Like
is it?
it's useless. I don't remember the name of it. It was all hand drawings though. So I and hand illustrated. I should see who did the illustration. I'll have to look that up when I take it out. It's packed in one of those boxes right there.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, so you
Um,
start tying. Did you start with deer hair? Because that seems very ambitious.
no, no, no. One of the first flies I wanted to master because I thought it was pretty was a Mickey Finn.
Yeah.
And I will honestly say it took me a good probably 25 years to tie a good one. Just because until somebody shows you what it is and like to tie it right, you're not even close. And to find the right bucktail, because it's special bucktail that you need um,
What do you
to
mean by
tie,
special bucktail? Sorry, I'm not trying to go down a hole here,
no,
but
listen, um, when it comes to bucktail fiber, it's a natural product, right? So I can find bucktail that's great for a 3-inch clouser, but not good for a 4-inch clouser, or one that's good for a deceiver, but it's not good for bucktail streamers like those because you need a fiber that has the right shape and taper and crinkliness and all of those other attributes when it's an inch and a half long versus 3 inches long versus 5 inches long. Like you're doing a Popovic's hollow fly, that's you're most of the time on those big hollow flies, you're looking for unicorn hair to tie with because you're looking for the top 3% of all the tails that are ever harvested every year. And it just doesn't, everybody's fighting for
I have heard a rumor that certain states have got softer bucktail. Is that true?
it. What I will tell you is there's definitely a regional difference.
Why? How?
I don't know if it's, well, I'm not the person that knows all of this. The person that I think knows the most is probably Brad Buzzy at Buzzfly. Um, but I know that when it comes to whitetail deer hair, the body hair, there are 7 species of whitetail in North America, and not all of them produce deer hair that's good for spinning and doing, what we think of as spinning and stacking, right? Whether it's an elk hair caddis, we use deer hair for most elk hairs, or whether we're doing a muddler or a deer hair like a Mitsuka sculpin head or something like that, or all the way up to a bass bug. All of that hair, different regions, different types of animals, different places on the body typically as well. Well,
Right. Oh,
it's
see? Okay, so sorry, I totally threw you off there. So Mickey
no,
Finn. Then what
yeah,
happens?
I just kept at it. And my parents got me a book called uh, Masters on the Dry Fly. And in there was a chapter on, I wasn't a great trout fisherman. I'd never actually I'd caught one trout by hand jigging a red worm off of a dock one time. But I was, 8 years old, or no, I guess I was 10 or 12 years old, sitting on a dock, just like hand jigging it. So, but I wanted to tie good flies, and they got me this book. And in one of the chapters was using dry flies for bass and panfish. And it was written by Dave Whitlock.
Of course, yeah.
And, and at the time, I kind of knew who he was, you know, didn't really know who he was, but I knew of him. And growing up, we had a campsite down on a lake on the Virginia North Carolina border, and that's where I fished most of the time for bass and bluegill. So I was trying to figure out, things I could tie that would work because I would buy the little crappy foam poppers at the hardware store and at the gas station up there, by the lake, and every 13th one would last 100 fish, but the other 12, like after 3 fish, would be falling apart. So um, I wanted flies that were more durable. So I started, my parents got me a Metz #1 grade dry fly neck for my birthday one year. I was like 13, back when Metz was, Henry Hoffman were kind of, they were good, but they were really only really known on the West Coast. They hadn't even made it to the East Coast much. And it was way before Whiting Farms. And so I started tying mosquito flies, and I struggled to get that quill to actually wrap on the hook and not crack, and because I didn't know to soak it in water with air conditioner,
Oh, were they
which is
doing
what
that back then?
yeah, that's how most of them would do it. Is you'd take you're going to tie a dozen of them, let's say red quills or whatever. You strip your quills, put them in a little vial of water with some air conditioner in it overnight, and that would soften, make that quill more supple so it wouldn't crack as you would wrap it.
Yeah, I do it when I peel Rhea, but I didn't know that they were doing it back then. I mean, it makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I have in the little book that came with Cabela's, it was a little pamphlet. I won't even call it a book. It was 10 or 12 pages. It was by Eric Leisure. And in it, he talked about dyeing with Kool-Aid.
Oh, interesting.
And I had forgotten about it. I'd remembered that you could until I got a book by Drew Chacon maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And I dye with Kool-Aid quite often now.
And it
It's
stays?
Yeah, you just have to set it with an acid just like any other dye. Vinegar is what I use, just like I use Drew's recipe to the T. It's perfect. Like it is absolutely fabulous. Um, and it's so cool what you can do by taking the two, because it's whatever color the packet is what the color of your fiber will be at the end. And I'd say you can put it into a computer and go, all right, if I take this one and this one, what color? And like And then there's forums where people will dye like crocheting yarn and knitting yarn with the same thing, and they've got like 1,000 options. Like if you do two of the lemon limes and one of this is like, and they have every fiber like imaginable, like every color combination. It's crazy what you can do.
Do you just
You
neutralize it
can,
with vinegar after?
Drew has you put vinegar in with the dye as it's soaking, but
Right.
no, it's the acid that sets the color in.
Yeah,
That's
right.
all.
How interesting. Okay. You don't have to worry
Yeah,
about smell or anything. Does it just smell fruity?
it smells fabulous.
Yeah. To fish
To
though?
get the I listen, I know that a lot of people out in the Midwest where I was there, they would method feed carp and they wanted fruity smelling dough balls, right? Whether it was tutti frutti or pineapple or mango. So maybe it helps. I can't answer.
The question
Yeah.
is, would somebody who deemed themselves a purist get offended by the smell of fruit and or offended by the smell of shrimp, but not offended by the smell of fruit? I'd be very curious to hear people's thoughts.
Oh, that would be an interesting because in the think about it, in the soft plastic world, there's a lot of people that have like grape or anise scented plastics. But the moment that they started adding actual like fish product, whether it was squid or shrimp or they had, that's bait now. So it's an interesting point. You're right.
Yeah, curious. Okay, so then you're tying these flies as a kid. You get these beautiful materials. You're starting to make your way in the fly tying world, and in
Yeah.
you're still in high school at this point.
Yeah.
What did you take a break like so many people do in high school, or did you double down and tie even more?
Oh, I doubled down. I doubled down. I think it was my either sophomore or junior year over the Christmas holidays. I had befriended a guide in Maryland named Mark Kovach. He guided on the Upper Potomac River for 42 years, I think, before he retired. Um, and he was a he taught auto body shop at the one of the universities in town in Maryland. And in summers, he was a fishing guide. But he gave me a winter order for flies for smallmouth. I don't remember. It was like 70 or 80 dozen. So I sat down during Christmas break and tied, and all through the spring and tied up his order of flies. So he was my first order then. To jump forward, then I went to college. I didn't get to tie much during college. I took full course loads even during the summertime, so I never had time off really. And then I graduated and I wanted to sell flies again. He gave me my second first order because I called him and said, I'm doing it. And he's like, great, I'll take. And he's like, remember that one fly you tied? I'm like, yeah. He's like, I'll take 6 dozen of that one. Um, and then when I was coming back this time in 2018 to do my third time, I called him and said, hey, I'm back in it again. He's like, great. And he gave me an order right away as well.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah. And he's still a good friend. Like we still talk 2 or 3 or 4 times a year. He's kind of retired from guiding outside of like if you've guided with him if you were his client for a while, he'll still go fishing, but he's not looking for new clients. He's not, he wants to do, he's got a grandkid. He's into that part of his life now. So he goes fishing with friends now instead of, trying to make a living out of it,
Yeah.
which
Is
is
that
nice.
is that where your career was starting to take you, in fishing specifically? Because I would imagine you're still being a chef. Were you working nights as a chef?
Uh, so yes and no. I've worked everything from hotels, private restaurants, um, corporate dining, retirement homes. So I've worked everything from, being at in the or in the kitchen working at 4:30 in the morning and then closing the kitchen at midnight. So, and I've done everything in between. I worked in Bermuda for a summer too. That was that was an ordeal. That's an island full of professional alcoholics right there.
It's also a very stressful career, is it not?
Horribly so. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's one of the
So
reasons why I got out of it.
that's what I was wondering. Did you sit down and make the ultimate decision that you were going to go into fishing, or
No,
did you
I
contemplate an
got in.
office job?
Yeah. So after I got out of kitchens, I went into food buying.
Got
I
it.
bought food for 15 years.
Yeah, right.
I
That makes
imported
sense.
food. Um, yeah. And I did that in greater Boston area was New Bedford. We were a especially food importer and distributor there. And then my vendor got me to go to Chicago and work for him.
Got it. And
It
then
took
the
3 years, but I went.
And then the fly tying was just something you were doing on the side, or were you doing any commercial orders at that time?
I no, by the time I got into food buying, I had stopped doing commercial orders. I was tying for friends. I still tied 3 or 4 nights a week. I had my fly tying desk in the living room, and I could watch the TV from it. Like on Sundays, the football games would be on. I'd be tying the whole time. Um, and in Chicago, the first 10 years I lived there, I didn't like ice fishing. I didn't understand it. I didn't want to try it. Um, so I all winter long, and it's a long winter in Chicagoland. I was I sat there and tied flies, and I'd give away, I don't know, 30 dozen a year probably, whether it was to my boss, or my friends, or local TU chapter needed a fundraiser. So, here's 50, 60, 70 flies, in a box, whatever it was.
Right.
And I took a lot of pride in trying to figure out how to take a normal fly and just make it more durable. Because if you, we were talked earlier about the driftless area, it's not hard to go to the driftless area and catch 50 or 60 fish in a day. That's kind of a ho-hum day in the driftless. They're not terribly giant. They're all 8 to 12 inches for the most part. You'll get some 15-inch kickers and a couple of 18s to 22s every year. But there's a lot of fish. So I didn't want to have, to go through 8 flies a day. That's craziness. I figured out how to make my flies last 3 weeks, like 3 weekends. I wanted them to last three, four, 500 fish, and I got it to that point on almost all of my flies. There's only
Was
a
it
few that I couldn't do it to.
was it primarily thread, lacquer, or technique?
It's all three of those. So I have it in most of my slideshows. To get durability in the fly, that takes proper technique, proper thread tension throughout, which means a lot of people, when they, instead of wrapping in a 360, when they get down to like 3 o'clock on the far side, they kind of pull it straight back instead of keeping the tension all the way around in that 360-degree angle. They loosen up the pressure at some point. They tie more in like an oval. So that's one of it. And then the proper use of adhesives as well. I have 9 adhesives on my desk, and I use them all.
I remembered that when we did our fly tying net the other night, because people who don't know this, you do some fly tying for anchored members, and we've even started to do your own page in the fly tying section, and we love your work, which we'll talk about more in a bit. But you mentioned lacquers or cement, and that you could
Mhm.
almost tell where people are from via or by way of which
Yes.
they're using. And I wanted
Yes.
to ask you about that. So in my head, while you said that, I was like, okay, what do I know? Sally Hansen, West Coast, Zappa Gap, South, Epoxy, Far East. Where does your head go as far as,
All of those are correct as well. But
okay,
then
good.
the other thing is if you start thinking about the vinyl cements or rubber cements that we use to attach eyes a lot of time,
Yeah.
um, there's Goop, there's Zappa Goo, and then there's E6000. E6000 is a Midwestern one.
Okay.
And then there's a small little community inside of there. If you were a Chris Helm disciple, you use Bond 527, but it's a rubber cement. It's just another version of it. And then E6000 is Midwest. Zappa Goo is kind of like the South, and then Goop is New England in the Mid Atlantic.
It's so
Like
funny.
yeah, it's like you said. And then there's Sally Hansen's Hard as Nails. That's a New England thing as well, um, and it's a Southern thing. And I don't know if because I don't want to talk. This might get us in trouble. There's a little bit of a frugality to those regions, and Sally Hansen's is inexpensive, and it works pretty gosh darn well
Oh
for
my God.
what
As
it's
a
supposed to be.
steelhead bum, it was what we all did. We didn't have money for fancy goo. No way. It was
Yeah,
mom's nail polish.
well, and it dried quick, right? And it was clear, and it lasted pretty good, and it had some different properties versus, Dave's Flex Cement versus Head Cement, right? It was kind of a combination of both. It has a little bit of a bonding property. Head Cement doesn't bond at all. Head Cement is just a sealant. That's all it is. It waterproofs things essentially. Um, Dave's Flex Mint bonds things, but it kind of dries hazy. It's not super clear. So Sally Hansen kind of gives you a little bit of both of those,
Are there
right?
any other materials off the top of your head that are regionally specific?
Um, uh, kind of. I'll say like when it comes to light cured acrylics, Tough Fly, which was the first and original uh, light cured acrylic, which is all, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but all of these, whether it's Gulf, Raid Zap, or Solarez, the whole purpose of all of those was to replace epoxy, right? Because epoxy was just a pain to work with. You had 3 to 5 minutes. You could never get it all used up. It was hardened up in this, and it would brown over time. Like it was it was a solution to that problem. It was the first one, and it's still only ever it never left New England. Bob Popovic's made it popular with Klauser and Lefty. Those guys were the ones that were promoting it, and it never really. There was a little tiny bit of it being used, I think, in Florida as well, which is where it was kind of developed. Um, but it never made it out of there. Whereas Solarez and Gulf and Raids app, all those are very much more popular the rest of the US.
Got
So
it.
that's the other one.
What about like Flash or any other or Thread or anything? Have you found that that gets any geographic favoritism? So I'm putting you on the
Um,
spot here.
yeah, no, I'm rather particular with threads. I mean, at some point I'll show you my thread rack. I have probably a 250 spool thread rack, and then I have another 200 spools sitting on the floor in a bin down there. I'm a lot of people I find, don't necessarily know why they're using the thread they're using. Like they just use NanoSilk every fly all the time. NanoSilk is an amazing thread, very expensive, and you don't need it for a lot of your flies. Like if you're just tying a woolly bugger, there's no point in, you know, using it. Now. It doesn't harm you, but it doesn't help you any. Um, Whereas, you can still use Danville and UTC Wapsi, which are, I don't know, I'm trying to remember the retail price. I pay wholesale. Uh, they're 250 a spool. They're very inexpensive and they work just fine, for those kind of things. But like, um, I don't know. I'm very particular on my thread usage. Um, because I think that it does matter in certain applications. It doesn't matter all the time, but it does matter sometimes. So where it matters, I really make sure like the only purple thread I'll use is UTC. It's the only purple it's phosphorescent. It has a UV. You put a UV light on it, it glows.
It does,
All
yeah.
the other purples, all the other purples look purple, but you put a light on them, they just look black. But that one, it glows. So it's the only purple I'll use. And I have a love-hate relationship with UTC. I'll buy 10 spools. I'll get two flies into them on the first one and just throw it out because it just starts to blow up or the spool will crack or there's always seems to be kind of an issue with UTC. I know they think they've got it fixed. And I hope they do. It's been a while since I've had one fail on me, but it was many years of them failing. Like it
Yeah,
was like one or two
interesting.
out of 10.
That was mostly
So
the spool though, or the thread? Because if they could put that thread on the unithread spool, would it solve it?
it was come to find out that what they've told me is it was the machine they used to put because they buy it in like 10,000 yard spools and they have to put it on the little 100 yard spools or whatever it is we buy. That machine was putting it on either the wrong tension or wasn't wrapping it right or something.
Where do you think that thread was initially used? Because surely it's not just made for fly tying. Is it used for blankets or embroidery? What's it used for?
Yeah, I'm sure it's somewhere in the garment industry. I don't know. But I do know that the only reason they came up with it is because they couldn't keep Danville in stock. They said if they could have kept Danville in stock, they would never have needed to create it. They had to create it because Danville, like, the fly tying industry to Danville is second fiddle always. Like it's whatever their main industry is, which I assume it's garments, and textiles. Like that's where their drive and all their sales are. And then we get the scraps, you know.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we had this order from 2 months ago. Let's finally get that filled. We got a little bit of downtime.
Yeah, sounds like
So
the fly fishing industry. Okay, let's get back to
yeah.
your timeline. So you start really diving deep. And as you know, I'm inching towards your story or your parallels or your I guess your crossing paths with Dave Whitlock. But I don't
Yes.
want to race you too far forward. So where do we go next with your timeline?
Um, well, we can get kind of close to there. So in 2000 18, I think it was 18. Yeah, I go to with my wife, we go to the Denver fly fishing show. And she's in the middle of negotiating her job, so she's having an awful time there. And she's not a fly angler, and she's bored out of her mind going, all of this is for fly fishing. This is crazy, right?
Yeah.
Um, and she befriends a booth, just likes hanging out there. Come to find out it's Dave and Emily Whitlock's booth. And more importantly, she'd befriended Emily. She was sitting there, they were chatting, um, and she bought me that one, that print right there. You can see that's one of Dave's prints, is the Six Southern Gentlemen. Um, and I have a bluegill one, and I have another one somewhere. I don't remember where it is right now. Um, but so yeah, and one of the things she did for me there was she bought us the Dave and Emily were doing fly fishing schools at their home there in Oklahoma. Dave had a pond put in that they built, fed by a spring creek on the property, and the spring creek he built to be a trout stream as well, with 20 or 22 pools on it, or holes, whatever you want to call them. And he designed it, built it, and it's a fabulous trout stream. They never have summer kills from heat. They have issues with herons and otters, but not with the summertime temps are always fine. It's never dried up. Um, so and he refills the pond from the creek. They put a pump in to pump the water into the pond. So they do these fly fishing schools, and she bought it for us. And the other half of that is we're at, like, it's a 2-day school. Halfway through the first day, Lisa's kind of done. She's like, this isn't for me, which I already knew, but she was a good sport. So she and Emily sat there and started drinking wine. And then on day two, Lisa didn't spend any time with me. I got a private lesson from Dave for a whole day. And at the end of it, at this point, I knew we were moving to New York, and I was leaving the food importation business, and I was going to try to make another go at tying flies. So I brought probably close to 2,000 flies with me to show Dave my flies. It's like, look what I can do. I can tie this and this. And he's going through, oh, that's an interesting nymph. You ever think of doing this to it? And I do now. Like, he wanted a softer tail, and it made a big difference.
In
Um,
what? In what? In presentation?
Fish catchability,
Oh,
having a little
how?
bit of it was like a gold ribbed hair zero. It was my version of it. And I used a very stiff fiber for the tail. It gave a strong silhouette, but it still worked. Listen, I caught a lot of fish in that fly over the years, but by adding a softer tail to it, it gives it better action, especially in slower water.
Okay, got it.
In faster water, it doesn't matter as much, but in slower water, it certainly helps to have a tail that is a little bit softer and not pure guard hair. Leave some of the underfur in. So, but yeah, so at the end of that day, we're sitting there. Dave's having his scotch and soda, and I'm having some wine. And Lisa reaches over or talks to Emily, goes, "Is there anything you guys could do to help Alan out with this business that he's trying to start?" I think I had the name for it by then. I don't know if I had Fly on the Water or not yet. And Emily, from not quite across the kitchen, but 10 or 15 feet away from Dave, goes, "Dave, is there anything we can do to help Alan out here?" And
Oh,
Dave just goes, "I don't know, but we'll figure something out."
oh my goodness.
And then a couple months later, anybody that's ever known Dave understands what this is like. Then I got a letter from Dave. And Dave never wrote an email in his life. I don't think he ever typed anything in his life, but he would handwrite in his beautiful, almost calligraphy like handwriting, a letter. And in
Oh.
this letter, he wrote to me, he said, "I'd like you to be my legacy tie, or I'd like you to learn my flies. I think you'd be a good fit." You know, I wrote back like a 6-page response, typed it up, mailed, never got a response back. Like, it was, I went way too far, way too deep, way too quick. But yeah, that's how it started. Is my wife had the gumption to ask Emily for help, and then Dave and Emily figured out that I might be the right person for this. I
So
almost ruined that on the first day too.
you scared him. Let's pick
Yeah.
that apart a bit. So, um, had he been thinking about this for a while as far as
Yes.
having somebody keep his patterns? And I don't see anything about Dave being related to vanity. Was this
It wasn't.
purpose just for historical reference? What was his reason?
Um, I don't know that. I don't know all of that. What I can tell you is I know he wanted somebody to keep teaching his flies and some of the techniques and stuff that he showed me the way he did it. Because what I learned over the course of all the time I've spent there at that property with him, and even after he passed, is he did everything for a specific reason. He might not have had time to tell me it over the years that we had together, but there like nothing was just done because, oh well, let's try this fiber and see. No, he tried 15 different things and landed on this one because that was the best option. Um, I think I said this the other night in our class we did on the sheep minnow series. Those little plastic beads that up in the Pacific Northwest they'll peg like 2 inches above a small hook. You know, the salmon eggs or
Mhm.
trout eggs. At one point, I found samples of the sheep minnow series where he took that plastic bead, shoved it around the hook, and used that for the gill instead of the dubbing to see if it was better. Um, it wasn't because he never talked to me about it, never did anything. He never taught me that. So it's not what he wanted, but he did try it. Like he was always trying things. Um, just as like the sheep minnow, um, I don't know when he started adding the kind of like the shoulders to it, but as I went back through his historical flies when I was taking photos of them, I could see at a certain point, all of a sudden, every fly that was newer than that time, they always had it from that point forward. So he liked adding, he was always trying to improve the fly. And I thought that was not just interesting, it was humbling to go that this is somebody who had been tying this one pattern for 50 years and wasn't still happy with it. He was still willing to think that there might be a better way. And I think that was a big learning moment for me to realize that there's flies aren't done ever. Whether it doesn't matter whose fly we're talking about.
It's a lot of pressure to team up with somebody who is such a perfectionist because in a
Yes,
lot of ways that pressure would have been put onto you. So how did it look from here? You write him this letter. He kind of takes a step back and goes, "Whoa, that's a lot of writing back to do." And he can't just respond with little asterisks in red below you. Um,
right.
did you just call him and say, "Should I come over?" Where did it go from there?
Oh, I tried. They didn't return the calls. I didn't know what was going on. And then the pandemic started, and
Ah,
he sent me a letter saying, "Hey, there's a," and I still have it. He gave me. It was Emily had to type them up. There were tying instructions to tie uh, his uh, periodic cicada, and he sent me all the materials as well. He said, "Would you please tie these for me? We want." We had ordered them from Rainey's. Rainey's didn't deliver. Would you tie me 600 or 800? I forget what the number was. It was a lot. Um, and but literally, he gave me like, here's the hook. Scratch the hook, like his standard stick, and that there was in a piece of foam in a box, and there was the hook. And then there was the Zappa gap on it and the thread, and you'd like cut the thread off, and there was like, an inch tag on each side. Then lay the mono foundation. Like he did every single step and showed me how to tie the fly step by step with like, so he had to sit there and tie 25 of these things, but only one part at a time, right? Um, and then all the materials came and he said, "Would you do this?" So I did it. And I think he liked the work that I did. He had to fix a few things. I didn't trim the wings quite right. Um, but he fixed them, he said, for me. And then yeah, then I started going out to visit the first, I don't know how many times, but I would rent a car here. I'd drive all the way to Oklahoma, um, because we were both worried about, COVID and hurting him. So I slept in the car on the way there. I didn't get hotel rooms, so I wouldn't interact with anybody. I wore an N95 respirator the whole way, if I went into the rest stop or the gas station, and then I would take COVID tests with me. And every morning before I would go over to him, I would test for COVID in the morning because I wasn't going to be the one that killed Dave Whitlock,
no.
right? So, because at 80, at that point, I guess he was 86, you know, I don't know if COVID would have killed him, but there was a good likelihood, right? So, um, I didn't want to, but it was a lot of work, but I would go over there for about a week at a time. And he didn't like doing that long of a time period. He normally would only have people come for 2 to 3 days at a time. Even his dear friends like Davey Watton normally only stayed 2 or 3 days at a time because he had to get back to doing art or corresponding with somebody else or doing something, right? He had a like he always wrote for Trop magazine. He still had those duties, but I always convinced him to say, guys, listen, I'm driving out. It's taking me a day, it takes me almost 2 days to get there. Takes me 18 hours in the car, 18 hours back. So there's 4 days. For me to do that and only be there for like 2.5 days, like the juice, isn't really worth this, or what is it? The squeeze isn't really worth the juice there, right? Um, or the juice isn't worth the squeeze. I don't remember which way that saying goes, but I had to get more than 2 or 3 days. So I would go 4, 5, 6 days at a time. Um, and, you know, and then we're both perfectionists in one way in that I was like, oh, so what do you do when you have this fly and it's not quite right? Is that the one you put in your box? He's like, I don't have those flies. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, just undo it and tie it right. And that was because I would always like the flies that I would give away would always be the ones that were absolutely like the best. Like sit down and tie 3 or 4 dozen for an auction or whatever. And the best 2 dozen of those are the ones I would put out. And I would keep the other ones and fish them.
Yeah,
And
same.
that's
I
when
do
I
the same thing.
realized, yeah, now I've realized, stop, just make the fly right.
That's fair.
It sounds really simple, but there are so many tires that I watch go, oh, that's good enough. And it bothers me so much now
Really?
because I know what these guys are capable of. A lot of them are my friends, and I know that they're capable of better. And it bothers me that they aren't willing to just. You saw that was wrong. You just told me that, and you're in the middle of the fight. Undo 3 turns, and you can fix it. Like,
Yeah, I guess if you're already there, I think for
right?
me, when it's just not great, it'll be something typically in the material, and it'll have come down to a decision where either I bin or I throw away that piece of material, or I use it and keep it as a fishing fly. But not so
Yeah.
much the technique or how it's put on. It's more just the
Yes.
material itself.
Yeah. Well, and in that case, you're right. Like, if it's a material variability, you've got to accept that's the natural variability of something, right? Um, but if it was a tech, I'm talking more on the technique side. When I
Right.
see somebody do something and it's like, well, you mounted that wing and it's cocked, it's 15 degrees off. Like instead of it being parallel, it's like this. Like
Fix it. Yeah.
just fix it. Um,
So
it
I
it
get that. Yeah.
yeah. So
How did it look then with your visits to Dave? Did you guys ever have the conversation of what exactly it was you were doing there and why he
yes,
was giving you this time? How did that sound?
that conversation came from Emily on the second day because I told you on the first day I almost ruined this whole thing. Um, So growing up, I fished bass ponds and stuff, just around the corner, the neighbor's pond or whatever. And I was catching, buck bass, 10 to 15-inch bass on topwater flies. It's what I like to fish. And back then, you would get flies that have a weed guard that came around the bend of the hook and went up to the hook eye. And for those little bass, they couldn't they couldn't deflect that weed guard out of the way. So you would miss a lot of fish. So I would always cut those off and then I'd lose my fly. You know, what are you going to do? So at one point on that very first day, the way those days worked is I would show up between 9 and 9:30. We would tie until lunchtime, which was noon. We'd have lunch. Dave would take his nap at 1 o'clock every day. At 1:30, he'd wake up and we'd tie until dinner time. And
Wow,
then,
that's a long session.
oh, it was. Yeah. I mean, that's how I got through 100. I used to know the number. I think it's like 114 or 124 patterns of his 400 patterns.
Oh my goodness, that's a lot.
Yeah, it's a crazy amount. And it's all in notes and in my head, and it's really hard. Like I have to go back and reference my notes and go, all right, did he put this on the inside or the outside? I know it's there, but I don't remember, did he put the lateral scale inside the hackle or outside the hackle on this one? Because sometimes it was inside, sometimes it was outside. Anyways, so he asked me on that first day. The first day we didn't tie a fly in the morning session, even though we were supposed to. We just talked for 2.5 hours and really good. I thought it was a really good conversation. We got along. Um, he was very personable to me, which if you knew Dave, he was always personable.
Yeah.
But one of the questions he asked me is, What do you think of weed guards?" And I quote, this is what I said: "They're fabulous fish prevention devices."
Okay.
Because that's what my experience was, right? When you're catching a 12-inch largemouth on a pond, they can't bend 25-pound mono as a loop, mason hard mono, right? So the next day I come, and instead of Emily says, she texts me, "Hey, come to the house in the morning," instead of going upstairs to the studio. I'm like, all right, cool. And I get to the door right there. She has a big glass of iced tea. I love iced tea. And she had it ready for me. And she said, "Come in and have a seat." And they had a really big freshwater fish tank of native fish from their spring creek there, or their little trout stream, spring creek. Cardinal shiners, bluegill, they'd keep crayfish in there, and whatever else they could catch out of the creek. And have a seat, Alan. She asked me, how I slept or whatever, but like a minute into the conversation, she goes, "Yesterday you said something that really upset Dave." That was the beginning of the conversation. Yeah, no. And she goes, "Alan, I could see your face. Like you went both pale and flush red at the same time." Um, because I thought I screwed this whole thing up. Um, she goes, "Dave's going to teach you things that everybody else is going to tell you is wrong, or they're going to say it's not necessary. We need you to keep an open mind to all of this. Dave has a reason for everything. He'll get it. He'll get you there, but it might take you a while. Like it took me 4 years to realize that that fly tying is an art. Prior to that, I always thought fly tying was mechanical. Like I'm copying this pattern, I'm tying it. Here's the technique, I'm doing it. That's all it was to me. Um, but he told me at the beginning it's an art, and I was like, "Oh, okay, yeah, sure, whatever." It took me 4 years to understand what he meant. Just as with the weed guard, I am 100% sold. When we put his fly tying desk in the American Museum of Fly Fishing, there was 100 people in the room. I said, "Anybody here? You guys, I want to challenge all of you guys to use weed guards. Everybody here, you guys, if you don't know my number, somebody in this room does. Ask them. Call me. I will teach you how to do it. These things are life changing, like in terms of your fishing ability."
I love
Um,
weed guards. I want to ask you more about that after, but first I want to hear this
yes,
conversation and how it goes.
yeah. So the, the end of that conversation was Emily goes, "So what Dave wants you to do today is go fishing. Here are some flies that he has for you," and they were his flies, and they all had weed guards on them. And she says, "Your first 30 casts, you have to throw 3 feet onto the bank or into the tree." And I remember thinking in my head, not a problem. I will do that. I will go get that fly every time. Not a problem. It's not hard to go get a fly. I never had to go get the fly all day. I didn't miss any fish all day. And I now 100% sold on weed guards. I tie them on virtually every fly I can.
Yeah, I use them. I use them depending on where I'm fishing. But so I understand what you're saying about the fish prevention because you're thinking the full loop and the size of the mono. Did he do a
Yes,
full loop or did he do the little strands? How did he do it?
he had, let's see, one, two, three, four techniques that I can think of. There might be a couple more if I think about all the different patterns. So he still did the loops if he was fishing for big fish in really, really, really heavy cover. They're the most snag resistant option there is because it really does protect the hook point the best. But you will miss fish off of it occasionally. And then he also had this other way where he would do two of those loops, but he would kind of cross them underneath the hook point. I can't explain it well. It gave the loop more rigidity and moved the bump that it created out in front of the hook point. Um, so that was an interesting one. He would do that on some of his older flies. If you go back to maybe the mid 90s where he was skidding flies into Umpqua or into like Cabela's and Bass Pro, where it was like uh, the Whit hair jig and the enticer and some of those older bass flies that were trying to imitate worms and salamanders and grubs and things like that. Those old flies, I would see that weed guard system on there because you're pulling it through timber, pulling it through uh, you know grass beds, things like that. But what he's really moved to more than lately is the ones I showed you on the crayfish, where it's either a single or a double foot tied proud of the hook point, but short of the hook point always. Um, and it doesn't matter if it was the wit hair bug, the bass popper, or the diving frog, or any of those other topwater flies, his sheep bluegill, the waking bluegill, those things, or the crayfish, the sculpin. Um, he would add it to any one of those. Um, that's the fifth one. And he also had this other technique. He did it in the hopper in the Matuka Sculpin. He could, if there was a deer hair head, he could add a weed guard to any deer hair head without thread using Zap-A-Gap. And I didn't think that would be very durable. I took a hopper to the driftless area and I only did it to one, and I finished the week with like 250 trout on that one fly, and it was still there, hadn't fallen out. Like I was blown away with how durable that super gluing in a piece of monofilament into deer hair was.
And always monofilament? Did you guys try other materials?
As a kid, I did. So I grew up in Frederick County, Maryland, which is where Lefty was from. So Lefty liked to use trolling wire. So I used that as a kid, and it works great, except for when it finally deflects and gets bent out of the way, it's completely done. Like it gets to the point where it can't be repaired. Same with mono, though. I find mono is a little bit more resilient, um, but it also has the added problem of the end of it that you try to cut would always end up poking me, and those would always get like infected or be kind of like borderline infected when you'd poke yourself with that mono or that wire. So I tried it. I never liked it because it always just hurt. Um,
Yeah, it's fair.
so
What
I
pound
did that.
mono did you turn to? Did you turn to a lighter pound?
No, so for Dave's systems, whether it's the foundation underneath the fly and or his weed guard, I have everything. I think I'd have to check. I think I have 6 pound Mason. I might start at 8, and I have all the way up to 80 pound and everything in between.
And then do you choose that as per the size of the fish or as per the structure that you're fishing around?
It's the weight of the fly.
Or the fly? Okay,
So,
makes sense.
so if it's an underwater fly, most of your material in that fly is going to be neutrally buoyant. Bucktail underwater doesn't have any weight. Neither does EP fiber or, you know, crayfish claws on the crayfish. It's only the hook and the lead eyes that I have to deflect that weight up and over the obstacle. Whereas if it's, say, a deer hair fly that's floating on the surface, I have to get that wet deer hair up and over that log. So that thing with when that deer hair gets wet, it might weigh 3 ounces or 4 ounces. So I might be stuck going to 25 or even 30 pound mason hard mono on that weed guard to get that fly up and over a log or through lily pads, right? Um, and then I do a lot of saltwater flies and jungle flies. So, when I do a GT popper, I'd have to check my notes. It is either has 60 or 80 pound on it. Might have 40. I don't remember. But it's got really strong weed guards on it because I've got 5 inches of 35,000 lead inside that popper head. So it's got some serious weight to it. Like that thing has a thud um, when I toss it in my hand. So, but
Yeah.
it's one of the things I learned from Dave was a little bit of weight in your fly helps it cast better. You need some mass to overcome the wind resistance. And a lot of people have issues with those straight foam poppers, in that they kind of go 2/3 of the way out and then they kind of fall and die. Like so, by getting some lead inside of that body, I get it more surface area to bond to when I glue the foam on there, but I also get that thing to have some mass to overcome its wind resistance, and it casts a lot more accurately, especially in saltwater where you're always dealing with 15, 20, 30 mile an hour winds,
Yeah.
you know?
Were you also, or was he putting these guards on all of his flies, his trout flies too?
Um, so most of them, yes. If it was a streamer, pretty much it always had it on there. Like he didn't
Oh,
do it on like caddis larva, but he would do it occasionally on his fox squirrel nymphs if he knew he was going to be fishing in some different stuff like that. I have a strange feeling those were probably more for the bass fishing, but maybe if he was fishing around grass beds or something, he would have it on that. Um, and then he put it on the Dave's hopper, the Matuka Sculpin, the NearNuff Sculpin. I'm trying to think what other trout flies I've seen it on. The cricket, Dave's cricket. Um, those are the ones that are coming to mind right now.
okay.
But yeah, he would add it to those.
So you go fishing, you don't have to
Hmm.
retrieve your flies. You come
Yeah,
back, you sit down. Now you've passed Emily. Are you back with Dave at this set in this session?
don't remember. All I know is I made it past that point, because I came back and said, those worked really well. I didn't have to, and I didn't fish any of my flies that day. That was the other thing. Like I had my flies. I didn't need to switch. Like his flies were working great. Um, so yeah. And then I don't remember I'd have to check my notes. I think the first fly series he taught me was the fox squirrel nymph. That next morning, we tied two or three versions that morning. We broke for lunch. Um, Came back that afternoon, tied I think at that point we went right into the crayfish, and he just went, here's the rubber leg one. It's the same as that one. Here's this one. It's the same as that one. Because there's seven versions to the fox squirrel nymph. Um, and they're all the same. Like once you know the technique, it's the same. It's just the body shape changes. Or am I adding rubber legs here versus just the soft tackle? Or he had some rules. Size 12 and smaller, he didn't, or size 14 and smaller, sometimes 12. He didn't bother with the soft tackle feather. He would just scratch out the dubbing a little bit extra. Um, Size 12 and bigger, he would add the soft tackle feather. Rubber legs, he really didn't do them on, but like size 8 and larger. Um, he would do like for like his box had 10s and 12s, but like not commercially available.
Right. I wonder
Um,
why.
but there wasn't enough volume to try to sell that pattern as well. Like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? To have a size 12 fox squirrel nymph, you have the bead head and the non-bead head. Then you have the rubber leg with bead, without bead. Like all of a sudden, it's just too many SKUs for Rainey's to manage.
Yeah, that's true. I could see how there'd be lots of skews with a lot of his patterns. You tied for us the
Yeah,
other night, and what did we tie the other night, and how many variations were there? Let's talk a bit about the pattern.
I showed you guys the sheep minnow series.
Hmm.
So there's three generic patterns to that. There's the deep sheep, which think of it as that's the lead-eyed version. And I always tell people if your fly has to get down past 4 feet, you're fishing the deep sheep. Even with a sinking line, you're not going to get that swimmer down to 4 feet very easily and keep it there unless you're going with like a super fast sinking. And then you're kind of losing the swimming's ability to kind of hover. And so go with the lead-eyed. Then you have the swimmer, which just has some lead wire around the hook. And then there's the waker, which is a deer hair version, a deer hair head. And then after that, you can tie it into match different kinds of bait fish, whether it's emerald shiners, chubs, dace, shad, bluegill. I do an alewife version for some people up in the upper Midwest for some of the lake fishing up there. I've got a guy in Florida that wants pinfish and two other bait fish that I can't think of right now, but I've got to tie those for him. It's in the next, well, it was supposed to be this week, but it's not happening. Um, but yeah, scaled sard. He wanted a sardine imitation. I've done it as a, and then I've played around with it as just like in attractor colors. I've just done a white one with the chartreuse back, and I did a purple body with a black top. Um, and that, I mean, I caught a lot of tarpon on that black and purple one, juvenile tarpon. I wouldn't use an upturned hook for big tarpon, but it was, you know, it worked well. When I told him I did that, he wasn't disappointed, but he was like, "Oh, so you just went with an attractor instead of an imitative fly?" Like, yeah, like interesting. And I realized almost all of his flies, there's an attractive quality to them, but they're always trying to be imitative.
Was that a
He want
purist was that the purest part of him?
No, I think it was his idea was why not go for both? Let's have I used to jokingly call it a bass popper, but that extra ultralight airjet minnow that I showed you guys, it looks like a bass popper. And I would call it that to him. It would actually upset him. So I only did it like three or four times. He goes, Alan, it's so much more than a bass popper. So much more than a bass bug. And it is. You can make it look like a minnow. You can tie it to look like a dragonfly a little bit or a damselfly. Like you can do other things with it. Um, and it's a minnow imitation by itself. It's not just a generic surface fly that's making a disturbance. He didn't often actually pop it. He would wiggle it. He would make it, maybe do a little like a little chirp, not a big, you know, like a
Oof.
bubble bug, gabloosh. He
Yeah.
didn't want it to pop like that ever. Um, but that one, he tied it in some, that was one of the few flies he had in like attractor colors. He had one he called it the Midnight Express, which was kind of like a black and purple or black and blue. He did a Fire Tiger version of that, but he and I both think a Fire Tiger was just a perch fly, a perch imitation. Um, but he didn't fish a lot of attractors. The wit hair bug had some attractor colors in it. Um, but the Matuka sculpin was imitative. It had attractive qualities. The sheep shad looked like a shad, or looked like the sheep bluegill, looked like a bluegill, but it had attractive qualities as well, right? So he would throw in there, if you think of like a Royal Coachman, like that's the quintessential attractor, right? He would throw in those little fancy things that made it an attractor fly, but it also looked like the real thing as well. So he was always trying to get both out of the same pattern.
Yeah. And
And I think he accomplished that most of the time.
makes sense. Yeah, I'd say the same. At
Yeah.
some point, did you guys have the conversation? Did he say to you, I am investing my time into you for this reason? This is what I want. I want you to be my legacy tire. Did you guys have the conversation?
Yes, but not that straightforward. It was many conversations over the time. He's like, Alan, I'm showing you these things, so I want you to teach them. I want you to carry on. And and I don't want you to change it. Like I want you to, there's a reason I do it this way. Um, there's only one change I do in the crayfish, and it's how I tie in one feather. And I tell everybody that I don't do it Dave's way right here. This is how Dave does it. I do it this way. Um, it doesn't really change it. It just, I found that with the feathers I have, mine tend to be a little bit more brittle and they tend to crack when I do it his way. When I do it my way, I shouldn't even call it my way. It's Kelly Gallop's way. It doesn't crack. That's the only reason I do it. But when Dave passed, I went through and like the crayfish took me a year and a half to get him to approve. I've been tying for 35 years. It wasn't a hard fly for me to tie. I had the technique down 10 minutes after the class was over, right? Or the session was over. It took me a year and a half to get the material selection right. That was the hard part. That's what I've learned with all of his flies. One of his true secrets was he had outstanding materials.
Yeah, he did.
When he passed, he had 26 Cree necks in a shoebox, like a plastic shoebox. Like who has I have one,
I have
and I
one.
was proud of having one.
Same.
He has 26.
Yeah.
So, and because he told me when he ties the golden brown Matuka sculpin, it's like, oh, so what feathers do I need for this wing? Because we did an olive one in the class, I think. And he goes, "Oh yeah, just use Cree." I'm like, "Well, Dave, no, 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 no. I don't have any Cree." It's like, "Well, get some bar gingers and this and that, and like, and dye them up or whatever." Well, the reason why is he had a deal with Tom Schmucker from Wapsi that as long as he was out there promoting Wapsi, which he did for 40 years, 50 years, I don't know, a long time,
Mhm.
he could walk through the Wapsi warehouse, just grab whatever he couldn't grab it, but he could high grade whatever he wanted. He had to tell them, like he couldn't just walk out, but he'd be like, "Yeah, I took this and this." So that's how, like, he would just walk by and go, "Oh, that's a Cree. I better just grab that."
26
And
times.
like 20, oh, but over the course of all those years, you could do that,
Of
right?
course.
Because he
Yeah.
didn't sell flies. He wasn't doing commercial tying. That was the other thing. Like, he would tie a fly, give it away, donate things, give things for auctions, all that stuff. But it wasn't like he was trying to sell commercial flies. The
Yeah.
Matuka sculpin ruined him on that. The story goes, he had an order for something like 8, 10, 12 dozen or something like that. And he had to stay up for like 2 days to tie it. And he was like, "I'm done with that. I'm never doing commercial tying again." He was out of the commercial tying game. Um, because it was a friend that called him and said, "I need him really bad. I need him in like a week." So he did it, and
Oops.
he regretted it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You only make that mistake
Um,
once. I made that mistake once
yeah.
on a fly that took too long and that was it.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about some of the techniques because they're really
Yeah.
interesting. Let's start with the hook. Why did he? And of course, because we've already done a few tying nights together, I know the answers to these, but I'm going to throw them out anyway for other people. Why did
Yeah.
he file down the hook a little bit and the shank, not the obviously the hook tip?
Yeah. Um, so for two reasons. One, the finish on the most hooks is incredibly smooth, right? Especially if it's the nickel or tin plated hooks, those are almost polished smooth. So you would tie a fly and you could, on most any fly I could take and just spin that thing, right? A lot of tie flies you can do that. You can just spin your fly right around your hook. So he figured out that if I can get a foundation, my first layer of thread to never spin, my fly won't spin. So by slightly abrading that hook and applying the Zappa gap and putting your first layer of thread through that, you're bonding that thread to the hook. And by increasing that surface area and giving it some traction and some bite, it never spins. That was the that was one of the main reasons why he did it. He also thought it added to the durability of the pattern, which it does. Um, because you're the other part of why flies fail over time is if water gets into the fly and sits and comes in and it will start to rot from the inside out. So if you look at old flies, like a lot of the old, like, let's go back to like Carrie Stevens, she used lacquer, right? Which is head cement. That's what all head cement is semi-gloss lacquer, but it's a waterproofing agent. It's a sealant. So water can't penetrate anymore. Whether it's fresh or salt, it doesn't matter. Um, you could tie a lefty deceiver if you coated all of your aspects of that fly at every point with head cement back in the day, it wouldn't rot from the inside out. So you could keep your hooks from rusting as well because the salt water couldn't sit on that hook. Um, I've never seen black head cement on Dave's desk, so he didn't use it as far as I know. Um, he used his Fleximent, his Zap. He used epoxy, Sally Hansen's, Zapagoo, and Zap Gel. Those are the adhesives I saw him having. Um, but he wouldn't. That's how he would, because Fleximent will do the same thing. It'll seal. It's a rubber. It's a thin viscous rubber cement, so it'll or vinyl cement. It'll make things watertight as well. But that foundation is just to keep that fly from not spinning and not rotting from the inside out or rusting the hook from the inside out either. Because Zap-A-Gap is waterproof as well.
What about the conversation we were having about hook riding up or hook riding down? Can you elaborate on some of that?
Yeah, Dave was forced into a hook up for that sheet minnow because the striped bass he developed that fly for had really good eyesight in that clear water there of Bull Shoals and Norfolk Lake and stuff, or Lake Norfolk. And he had to hide the hook, which is why he went with a silver hook. When you have when you have a reflective hook like that, it reflects what's around it. So when you put material around it, all of a sudden the hook becomes invisible, or hardly visible, I should say, not invisible. Um, and then he did that your hook point up to hide the hook in the body of the fly. He's right in that you do lose a few hookups from it, probably, very low single digits, 2, 3, 4%. You'll miss because of that hook up. You just might not get the right purchase. But on the other side of it, like on tarpon, once you get to, I don't know, maybe a 30 or 40 pound tarpon, the inside roof of their mouth is as hard as stone. You're not getting a hook to penetrate, period. I don't care if it's an owner Aki or a good Gamakatsu, whatever. Like nothing's going to penetrate that thing. It's too hard. So that's why almost all tarpon flies for adult tarpon are always on a down hook. That's what we had mentioned before
What
in the
about thoughts on
conversation there.
upturned eye, straight eye, down eye?
Um, ooh, most of Dave's flies are I don't know of any of them that he did on upturned outside of some of the old Matuka sculpins he tied on some old partridge salmon hooks that had the loop eye, which the loop eye tended to always be upturned. I don't think he cared whether it was up or down per se. I think he just wanted that loop. He was trying to get partridge for years to bring that loop all the way down so that he wouldn't have to add the mono foundation. He wanted that piece of metal to go all the way down the hook shank. And they always promised him that he would do it, but they would never do it.
Was he going to try to tie in between, or why did he want the double up so it wasn't round?
Yeah, he never, most of his flies were not tied on a round hook. And by
Yeah.
most of them, I'm trying to think like the fox squirrel nymph, once it got to like a size 6 for sure, sometimes on an 8, he would add that mono foundation to it. Unless he was doing the traditional one without, if he was just doing like a soft tackle. But if he was doing anything with either bead chain or like a stonefly version of it or something like that, he put that foundation on there and took it out of the round and made it a little more flat. Um, but yeah, he put that foundation on every bass fly you can ever imagine. I'm trying to think of one he did that he didn't do it on. The only one that's coming to mind is I forget the name of the series, but he had a series where he was mounting a chicken feather with the hook, kind of like a Matuka, but he did like a Mylar belly to it. Um, he turned the hook up on that one. Forget the name of the series. um, match a minnow or something like that. I think he was really good with alliteration in his flies. Like one of the flies that he had that it's gone, nobody knows about it hardly anymore. It was called the multicolored, uh, the the magical multicolored marabou muddler, and it's a beautiful. It's one of the prettiest flies I've ever seen. Um, there's a if anybody has any, don't sell them, like save them. Emily has maybe 8 left that were collector's grade. I'm trying to get them off of her. So
Why
they're
would
just
these
stunningly pretty
flies,
fly.
why would they disappear? And can you bring some of them back?
Oh, I can tie all of them. He showed me how to tie most of these. It's his eye for color. I've never seen anybody quite like it. The only person that had an eye like him for fly design was Bob Popovics, in my opinion, because I think they both had the same idea. If you're just creating a fly to create a fly, wonderful, enjoy. You got to be solving something. You got to be creating it for a reason and trying to fix something that you see out there, like whether it's you know Popovich with his hollow ties and all of his bucktail use, or back in the day with the spread flies and the simper fly. Like Pops had a huge array of patterns to his creation as well. His ultra shrimp was one, but they were always trying to solve a problem that they saw or encountered while they were fishing, and that's what Dave was. The sheep minnow series was just Dave trying to catch landlocked striped bass. That was its origin. And then he said, "I wonder if this will work for largemouth, and if I do it like a bluegill." Oh, yeah, it does. And wonder if I take the same one and when I'm up here fishing and there's dace in the water, if it'll work to look like a dace. Yep, son of a gun, it does. Right? Like it was a it was iteration after iteration after iteration. So
Do you know if he had a problem that he never was able to fix, fishing wise, fly wise?
I do not. I do not. I know he was still working on things. Like he sent me flies just a few weeks or maybe a month before he passed of, Alan, what do you think of these? These are new ideas I have. I haven't shared, and I never will share them with anybody. They're cool sculpin invitations, brand new sculpin, like really cool stuff with brand new material too. So it was interesting to see how his brain worked like that, and how he was always getting the same silhouette out of the flies. Like he knew when it was a sculpin, like all of his sculpins have the same silhouette. Like I can I can see one of his flies from 20 feet away and go, that, yep, that's a Dave pattern. Is the silhouette of that sculpin. Like it's amazing how consistent he was.
He was very consistent. Did he put more emphasis on profile or color?
It has to be both. I guess profile because that's what they see from a further distance, right? They don't see color until they get up closer. Um, but both were important to him. Both were, I mean, you can't find any of his streamers that didn't have gills added to them. Every one of his sculpins has gills. All of his topwater flies have gills.
With what material?
Or I should say all, but
How so? How would
normally
he?
dubbing. Normally dubbing. Uh, Davey Watton originally did the SLF dubbing for him. Wapsie bought that from Davey. I don't know how many years ago, 20 years ago. But there's a whole series of Whitlock dubbings, and I think it's number 23 is minnow gills. It's a red dubbing with some red flash, and that's what he used for his gill dubbing for years and years and years. He switched it later on in his life. He found a new material, um, and I shared it with. So I I think, and I can't prove this part because he passed before I came up with this idea, or I put the ideas together. Henry Cohen loves this stuff from Renzetti, um, called fluorofiber,
Okay.
but only in one particular color. I think it's called fluorescent pink or fluorescent hot pink, and he adds it to all of his bait fish, but just right in the chin, just for gills. And it's a very small amount, and that's how Dave felt about his gills. Was a small amount right in the chin. Um, but Dave switched to this other dubbing from Hairline, and you would blend these. two colors together in this 2-to-1 ratio, and that color, like the color pink he got from it, matched the fluorofiber almost identically. And about a year and a half ago, I befriended Henry, or I should say, Henry befriended me after Dave's passing, and I was like, he was going through his cancer treatment at the time, so I sent him like packages of this, going, "Hey, what do you think of this stuff?" And he never responded. Come to find out that the treatment was going well, but it was awful on him. But I saw him this year in Atlanta, and he was like, "Alan, that stuff is it. Like, I'll be thank you for sending it to me. I'm playing with it. Like, it's really, I'll be changing my fluorofiber out, I think. So I'll be curious to see how he does with it, because I have found it to be incredibly effective. I've added it to so many of my flies. I add it to my hollow flies, my Popovix hollow flies now. It gives me a little bit of like a red core, a little gill effect in the middle of the fly. Maybe it's a bleeding head. I'm not quite sure what it, but when it's wet, it just looks like a little bit of blood up front.
What about eyes? Did he have the same, what's the word? Conviction with eyes as he did gills?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. When I first started doing the sheep minnow series, I was placing my eyes in my operculum spot in the wrong places. I wasn't quite getting the placement and the ratio right. And somewhere in my notes, like I have the letter he wrote back to me going, "Alan, you need to fix this." And he literally just drew like the head of a fish. He goes, "The eye needs to be here above the mouth, like above the mandible or the jaw. And then the operculum spot needs to be like," and he had to hand draw it for me, but he was like, and then over the eye, he took one of the eyes and glued it to the piece of paper, like the prismatic eyes. It was
Yes.
it was an it was one of the neat little things he did, like, and that, like, anybody that knows Dave, like he would just randomly send you like care packages or letters, like, and so many of his friends have reached out and said, "Oh yeah, I got here's one, Alan," and like we share them amongst ourselves. We don't share them with the public per se, but like you would just randomly get a letter from Dave going, "Hey, I was thinking of you. I tied you," and there's a box of like 12 flies with a note saying, "These are not collector's grade. These are fishing grade. Please, you must fish these." Like it was an order to fish them. He didn't want them to not be fished. He didn't want any of his flies to ever go behind glass. It really kind of irked him. He wanted them to be fished.
Yeah, I could see that. Um,
Yeah.
the operculum and his paint work. I think that's what sticks out the most to me is the art on the flies. Can we talk a little
Yes.
bit about that?
Sure. It's it's the thing I struggle with the most. I just tied up. There's 24 popping bugs over there. The ultralight airjet minnows. I just did 24 bodies over there because I need some for the summer for myself. And and I was doing them. And listen, the white ones like I've got, they match his pretty good. But he did yellows and fire tigers, and he did this one that was kind of like it's an old southern bass color. It would be like a yellow or fluorescent yellow belly, and then kind of like a tannish brown back. We always called them Bren colors, even though Brem didn't look like that. But so he had ones like that. He had the Midnight Express. He did some fluorescent yellow ones. He didn't fish fluorescent yellow often, but he did have them in his box. I think they were kind of like, you know, all right, got to try fluorescent today. Um, because he would normally start with that whitish one, and then he'd go to the fire tiger a lot as well. Then he also had Porky's Pets, so the white with the red face, right? And but yeah, I can't I don't share a lot of my hard bugs like that yet because they don't look as good as his. His painting was on them was just flat out pretty. Like he would take the time to, put six squiggly lines, like, and his hand was so steady because he was used to painting so much. I mean, the last, I don't know, whatever it was, 10 or 15 years of his life, he really purposely focused on the art more than the fly tying and the fly casting and the instruction and all that. He wanted to focus on the art for the last years of his life. And he did. He did a lot of commission work. I can never get as good as him.
What were his thoughts on UV? I remember this all breaking out, and I have wondered what he thought about that.
Oh, he used UV. Like he wasn't opposed, like he believed in fluorescent colors mattering. I mean, that's the I don't think he was the kind of person who said like let's throw UV in every single part of every single fly. But like his he did a caddis emerger series called the Trace Emergers. and his wing uh was it Antron or Xelon? I'd have to check my notes. I don't remember. I think it's Antron. Um, but it had Crystal Flash in it. It had Antron, which, once you get some light reflecting through Antron, it might not be UV, but it is definitely, bright and glowing in the water, especially when you put a couple of pieces of Crystal Flash in there. Um, is, always had like in his streamers, if they had dubbing in it, all of the dubbing, even his nymphs, they always had flash in them. So, and it was prismatic flash. Once that became available, the original, like Davey sent me about a gallon Ziploc bag of the very first batch of fox squirrel dubbing. And that was when it was before prismatic dubbing was available. So the it was flash that was a single color, right? And it was orangish flash. That's it. Now that same orange now has like that, like a pumpkiny red, and it'll be, a little prismatic. Um, but yeah, he he was all for it. He wasn't opposed to it.
What about commercially tied flies? How did he feel about those?
I can't say this for certain, but it was a necessary evil. Like, listen, he was happy for it. When he was the first royalty fly tyer in the world with Umpqua, and I don't know the volume of the flies at the beginning. I know what he told me it was in royalties, and it was a very large sum of money, especially back in the 90s. I know that it was for a while there, he thought that was his retirement plan. Like that was enough money to retire on.
Wow.
And then Umpqua took that away. Um, so he switched to Rainies in the mid to late 2000s. I know Bob did as well, Lefty did as well. That most everybody switched from Umpqua to Rainies at that point. Um, and they're still with Rainies. It was a, and why I say he loved and hated it was always a fight to get them to make the flies right, right?
Yep, I found that
They run
myself.
if they, yeah, they don't have the material, so they substitute, right? Well, you're like, well, that substitute isn't viable. Like,
Yep.
and there are certain flies, like I will say, Rainey's their fox squirrel series of nymphs, fabulous. Like it is hard to beat. Like I can't tie you a fly that's that much better than that, but I have to charge you like three times that price. They're very, very value driven on that particular pattern. They do a good job at it. Um, some of their deer hair work isn't half bad. Like their wit hair bugs, their Matuka sculpin is pretty good. For but they don't do the NearNuff Sculpin and the NearNuff Crayfish very well at all. I've seen a size 8 NearNuff Crayfish with a 2.5 inch long claw. The
And
hook
it
is like three
should
quarters of an
be,
inch long.
yeah, okay. Make it
Yeah,
make sense.
I mean it's four times the length of the hook shank, and it's supposed to be equal to the shank. They just had it. They ran out of feathers. They threw a schlappen feather on there instead for a claw. And it's like, yeah, come on.
Yeah, I think people need to
So
know that. I know for me, I was frustrated when I signed off on, you sign off on a fly and then you don't keep track of it for a few years. And then when you see it again, you're like, that's not my fly. I did not sign off on that. But my name's on it, but I did not sign off on that.
right, it's almost like that game of telephone, right? Like you taught this person, then they taught the next one, and by the time you get to the eighth person, it's like
Different message
my fly never
altogether.
had purple in it. Why is there purple in here?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We'll start to wrap it up. But I do want to just kind of rapid fire you on the top three things that you learned. Not personally, a lot of that will stay between you and Dave, but um, top three things you learned in your fly tying from Dave, things that changed your mind besides weed guards. We've
Um,
used that one.
well, no, that was one of them. It really is. Like I'm telling you, weed guards are game changing once you learn to believe them. I got Steve Maldonado, who's a big jungle fisherman. We were down in the Amazon last fall. I've convinced him he's going to start tying some weed guards on his flies. Um, so that's one thing. The other thing that I learned was uh, just do it right. Like stop. If you notice that the leg isn't set right on that hopper, or the wing isn't set right or whatever, stop and fix it. Don't keep going. Stop and fix it. Um, because if you do it that way every time, you don't have to ever go through a fly and go, "Ah, that's got to go in my box," and Then when you put it in your box, you go, yeah, that's always the last one you end up fishing because you know it's the poorest looking one in there. So it ends up sitting there for 3 years. So don't do that. Um, and then the other thing I mentioned this briefly before is fly tying is an art. I didn't realize that I had to ex not just accept it. I had to realize that I was selling art. I wasn't just selling a burned feather on a hook. I'm selling art. Like, and it's hard to realize that some people don't appreciate that. Like they go, um, some people aren't my customer, right? They go, well, I can tie that fly for less, or I can get that fly at the fly shop for less. You're right, you can enjoy it like that. We're not the right fit. But then there are other people that look up and come to me and go, oh my God, this GT popper, you figured out how to make it cast well. Yeah, I did. Oh my God, that's been one of my issues is I get it and it always lands 5 feet short because it doesn't unroll all the way. Yeah, I fixed that, right? Or I've got, the clouds are half and half with the weed guard that you can take down to the jungle and, you know, once a day you go into the wood to get your fly. That's it. Instead of every 40 minutes or 30 minutes, we were going in to get Steve's fly. It was often
Yeah, it's
to the
annoying, and your
point to
guide
where a
will hate
couple,
you.
well, they're used to it there. They've got electric motors, so we just motor right on over to get it. But it was one of those like it was a pain. Like, and every time you go into the bank, if you're fishing like a mangrove shoreline down in Florida or the Yucatan or Belize or something, like every time you go into that to get it, you've spooked 75 feet on each side of that bank.
Hmm.
So you've got to wait 4 or 5 minutes for them to pull you down to that to where you're getting to fresh water that hasn't been, ruined. Whereas if you don't have to go in and get your fly, all of a sudden you can fish at that bank much more effectively. I'm going to throw a fourth one in there because he would splice fly lines together with the Zap-A-Gap, and he showed me how to make what he calls the Whitlock quick tip, which is essentially cutting off anywhere from a foot to 3 feet of the tip of your fly line because he never liked loops anyways. And then he would splice in anywhere like on a 5 weight, it's about 15 or 18 inches, and on a 9 weight, it's about 3 feet um, of type 4 sink tip. And you could take your top water, like that little cork bug or a deer hair diver or whatever, throw it out, fish it. As long as you start activating the fly right away, it stays right on the surface. Not a problem. Count to seven though, and all of a sudden, your next strip, that fly dives down at a 45 degrees down to about 1.5 feet, 2 feet deep. And all of a sudden, you now add a vertical change element to a topwater fly. And there's, you know, Lefty talked about in his books, very, very few topwater fishermen fish topwater flies with a short sink tip like that. And he always wanted scientific anglers to build that fly line for him, and they're going to finally.
Oh,
They
good.
started it last year. It's called the Sonar Titan Mini Sink Tip. Um, they've but they put too long of a sink tip on there, which is fine. It's 5 or 7 feet or whatever. Dave always, like I said, the first thing he does with every fly line is cut the loop off, and he likes to do his Zap-A-Gap knotless leader connection on them. Um, but then they found out that there was an issue with the sink tip or something, and they're changing that. I don't know if it's going to be density compensated or something, but Brad at Scientific Anglers was telling me at the Denver show that they're going to redo it slightly and make it better.
Huh.
So yeah, so I'm excited because building those it's not that it's a pain, but it's kind of, you know, it's an hour to get everything, soak the PVC, get it off with the acetone and glue it and make sure you've got a good bond. Um, and I always thought that those bonds weren't going to be very strong. They're actually stronger than the fly line. The fly line itself will break somewhere else. The Zap-A-Gap bond is stronger than the fly line core.
Whoa.
Yeah. He caught a 60-pound wahoo on that technique with that just the knotless leader connection, let alone the splicing of the fly lines. But he caught golden dorado, tarpon, everything in the world. And my big trout in New Zealand was landed because I had that. I had a 15-foot leader on, and I had the leader inside my rod tip 3 times. Twice it went back out into my backing. And if, you know, I was fishing 4.5X trout hunter as my lead, as my final tippet. If that thing would have gotten caught on a knot, I would not have, that fish would have broke off. It was 8 or 9 pounds. That
Yeah.
fish would have been gone. But that knotless leader connection, there's nothing to it for it to slide through the guides.
Yeah, if you've got
So
the strength, that's the way to go. Fly on
yeah,
the water before we wrap it up. What are you doing now? What does Alan Roop do nowadays with Fly on the Water?
I sell flies. I do a lot of Zoom lessons online. Um, and you've seen when I the other night I figured out my camera setup was wrong. Um, but I push out a 1080p image when I do it, so it's very good quality. I do in-person tying classes at all of the winter trade shows, all the big ones, the fly fishing shows, but I also do the Virginia Fly Fishing and Wine Festival, the Gulf Coast Classic down in Gulf Shores, Alabama, the Maryland Fly Fishing and Tackle Collector Show. Some smaller regional ones, the Seven Springs Show that Chuck Furimsky does. Um, and then I'll be writing some articles. I'm somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the way writing the first book on some Dave Whitlock flies. I know
I
you
was
and I have
wondering
talked
about
about
that.
that as well.
Hmm.
Yeah. Um, I've got one pattern left to write, and then I have um, all the placeholders for what photos I need to take to make that work. So that'll be my project for after the show season is to get all the photography done for that one.
That's a big job.
It is, but I've already got the placeholders. Like I need a photo that's going to show this. Like in this technique, I need to show that. So like I've got that process down. It's just a matter of sitting down and tying 7 flies and taking some photographs as I do it.
Yeah. Oh,
So
cool. Well, I know you and I
yeah,
speak regularly, so I know I'll stay up to date on this. I will
yeah.
link you up in the write-up of the show. Is there anything else that you wanted to add or ask me before we wrap it up?
No, but I would recommend people go to davewhitlock.com and get some of his prints. They're really nice. And Emily still has a whole bunch of them. Like there aren't as many of the limited editions anymore, obviously, but there's lots of open editions still. Every one of his prints is available as an open edition just about, and they're really good value and they're stunningly pretty.
Yeah.
So
I love his art. It's so gorgeous.
yeah,
No
yeah.
originals left. Are they all gone?
Um,
They will be
so
now.
I think most of the originals were commissioned.
Yeah.
So yeah, but there's still, I mean, I know she still has a decent supply of the, so after that original was made, they would scan it they had a super expensive scanner and they have a G-Clay printer in their office. And they could print it out and it's UV protected ink. It's crazy what that thing does. And then Dave would go back with his colored pencils and enhance those. And he would hand write on it. Those are the limited edition prints. I know how many, roughly speaking, she has left. She's releasing a certain number every year, right? And those have gotten, relatively speaking, more expensive, as they should. But the open editions are just as they come off that printer. They're very, very nice. They're they're outstandingly good still, and they're a very good value. So I really recommend people look. And she has a whole bunch of them out there. She'll hit the Salbug Roundup in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then if you want to learn more about his Zap-A-Gap, either talk to me or he has a DVD that he produced. It's the best DVD he ever did on the Zap-A-Gap techniques. It goes through how to splice the fly lines, how to do the backing into it, how to use it in some fly tying stuff as well. But I have a whole bunch of like the way he adds it to a soft tackle feather is absolutely ingenious. The most durable soft tackle feather you'll ever see.
Okay. And then people can find you, like I said, Fly on the Water. I'm going to also link
Yep.
up your playlist on our website because I think that it's worth having a look.
Great.
And yeah, what are we tying next?
I'm moving tomorrow, so nothing. I've got a class. Actually, this will work next Saturday at the Lancaster Fly Fishing Show. I've got a class on the NearNuff Sculpin. Um, so that'll be the next class that I have and next fly that I teach is Dave's NearNuff Sculpin. It's such an underrated fly. Like if you want that fly that's I like Kelly's big flies, but I don't want to cast them every day of my life. Um, if you just like that like 2.5, 3 inch long streamer, it's perfect.
Yeah, it's a great fly. I love
So
that fly for
yeah.
everything.
Yeah. Oh, I've caught bonefish and permit on it. When I do my presentation, I go over it. I don't remember the numbers now because I haven't read it in 3 weeks. But there's over 100 species of sculpin in the world, and like two-thirds of them live in the salt. Some people call them sea robins, depending on where you're at. But yeah, they have that same giant pec fins on the side, big dorsal fin, big giant head. Yeah,
Actually, yeah, that makes sense. I just had a major
yeah,
flashback. I learned of sculpins first in the salt when I was a kid.
yeah,
And
yeah,
then I remember being a little kid and being super surprised that there was one in the fresh. I forgot
yeah,
about that. That's a long time
yeah,
ago.
yeah. And then there are little micro pockets of them. There's one in the Potomac River drainage system called the Potomac River Sculpin. It's nowhere else in the world, just right there. So there are some that are very regional and small. Then there's the slimy sculpin and the mottled sculpin are, 80% of the US. So there's a lot of small variety and then big variety. But that fly also imitates mad toms, stone cats. If you tie it in a look, change the coloration up, it can look like a darter, can look like a hog sucker, stone roller, any of those bottom dwelling fish.
Love it.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll let you get back to your evening. Thank you so much. Again, it was great to finally get to, I feel like every time that we chat, it's, obviously we've got 5 minutes till we roll with the live lesson. So it's nice to get to learn a little bit more behind your history.
Well, thanks. I really appreciate you having me on. It's been really fun.
Yeah. Thank you.